In this demo, I'd like to show you how data binding is implemented in HTML5 frameworks with a simple example. It will be a hello data binding sample. I've created an empty project in WebStorm, and let's say that we have an index.html file which contains two numbers. So basically I'll just clean this up for you. Let's say that we have two inputs. I give an ID to my inputs. Let's say that this is gonna be A, and I'd like to add those two inputs, but of course I'll do that with data bindings. So I would like to have a model, and when I change something in the editor, I would like the model to be updated, but I also need to have here a function which will output the result of my operation. So here I'll have the result. Okay, so because I have numbers, I'll just add a simple style. Let's say that because those are numbers, come on, there should be a style here. Yeah, so what I was saying is that I will set the text align property for my input to be right, and let's say that I also give the width of my input to be no more than 50 pixels. Okay, so this is how my HTML looks like, and I can preview this in Chrome. So this is how it looks like. Okay. So I would like to have a model and bind to that model those two values. When I change the value, I expect the model to be updated and the sum to be refreshed. Okay, let's suppose that I create here a new JavaScript file for my index. Let's call that index.js, and in here I'd like to define a module. So each time when we implement complex applications, we need to organize our code. So in order not to have naming conflicts, it's better to define your code in a module. There are several frameworks doing that can support defining and loading modules even dynamically, but now I like to define my own framework. So let's say that I implement a function to define a model, and I will give a name to the model. Let's implement the framework also in the same time. So let's create another JavaScript file called why not require.js, and let's say that for the sake of this demo I will not support dynamically loading of my resources, but instead I will just include them statically here. So I have a script with the source which is going to be my require.js file, and also I like to add a script with a source that's going to be, come on, sorry, once again, that's going to be my index script. Okay, so let's define the module in the same time. So I like to be able to have a function to define a module by its name. Also, a module can have dependencies. Let's say that I define a module with the name main. I will have another parameter which will be my list of dependencies. So those will be dependencies. Then I need to specify the implementation of my module. So here I will put a function, and my function will receive the exact parameters as one for each dependency. So here I will have the implementation of the module. This is the define function. When I use the module, I will call another function to include it by the name. So I have to implement the include function as well. So this is going to be a function as this one. So this will be a function called include, and I include the name of the module. Okay. So what I expect for a module to do would be to implement its internal logic to define functions, create local variables, and so on, and then return an object or a function that's going to be used when including the dependency by other modules. So for the moment, let's say that I have a function defined in my module, and the function will add two numbers. So it will receive a and b, and of course it will return the sum of those numbers. Then let's say that apart from defining a function internally, I would like, when the document is loaded, to be able to subscribe to that event and attach some bindings to my to the UI. And let's say that for that I will define an utility library which I will call jQuery, although it's not the real jQuery that you probably heard about. And when I say please include the dependency to jQuery, I also put here a name for the parameter. So jQuery as a model will return something that's going to be passed as argument. It's going to be injected here, and I will be able to use this later on. So for the moment, let's just create another script called jQuery, which is going to define my module. Let's say that here I'm defining jQuery, and jQuery will have no dependencies, but nevertheless will have to define something. And because I'm not loading the modules dynamically, I will then ask to include the script, and the source of the script is going to be here. It's going to be jQuery. So up to now I will be able to use jQuery that's going to be injected when including my module. So I expect from jQuery to provide me with a selector, and when I select the document, I would like to have a function to subscribe to the document ready event, and I will just pass a callback that's going to be executed when subscribing to document ready. I have to create such wrapper inside my my jQuery module, so let's go and create it. I go here, and in my jQuery model I expect to provide a way of selecting stuff. As you can see here, by this object that's going to be returned by jQuery model, I expect to have a function with a selector. So let's then define in my jQuery framework, let's just define that function. So in the end, my module will return a function, an anonymous function, which will receive a selector. So this is what jQuery does, basically. With this selector, I would like to check if my selector is equal to the document in the DOM model. Okay, this was supposed to be called selector. Okay, so if it's equal to the document, then I will just return a wrapper, a wrap document function that I will create here. Let's say I have a wrap document function, which is actually the one I will return here. Okay, so what I need for the wrap document function in here would be a ready function that will subscribe to the document, to the DOM loaded completely. So I go to my wrapper, which will create an object, and I assign that function to the object returned by this. So I will say this.ready is going to be a function which will receive a callback. Okay, this is the document ready function, and I just do something like document add event listener, and the name of the event is called DOM content loaded. Okay, and then I have a callback that I need to be invoked. So as you can see, my selector is returning a wrapper, and the wrapper is attaching to the result, to the object that's going to be returned, it's attaching to this the method ready. Okay, and in the end I will just return this. So now this will have the ready function, and then when I subscribe to the ready, I will be able actually to subscribe to the DOM content loaded with my callback. So when the DOM will be loaded, my function will be called. What I'd like to do with this function would be to register, to create a model and register some bindings. So let's just create a model, and I will just create an in-place object, and let's say that I will have a value, a default value for my first argument and for the second one. But I also need a function to compute the result. So the result will be actually a function which we'll call the add, but I'm not able to put here the link to the add function, because when I will call the result, I will not know from where to take the value of the argument. Okay, I have to invoke with two arguments, but where to get it? Instead, I will create another function, parameterless, which will then say to call the add method using those two properties of my object. So now I have my model created, and I like to be able to do a data binding with my model. No problem. For that, I'll define another module. Let's call it binding. Okay, and I'll require to include this module and make accessible this module via an argument called binding. What I expect to have for data binding would be a way with binding to adapt my model to the data binding feature. So first of all, let's create another module which will be the binding module. I'll call it binding.js. Here I will define a new module called the module binding. It will depend on jQuery because I will need to access the DOM, and my intention is to use such feature to access the DOM. So let's say that I will have a dependency to the jQuery, and then my binding will have to return an object which will allow me to use a function called adapt. Therefore, my binding will return, as I said, an object, and this object will have an adapt method. But for that, let's create a function called why not adapt, which will receive a model and will have to return an adapted model. So my property will call this function, and when I call the binding to adapt, first of all, when I define my module and I put here the dependency to binding, I expect that when the module is loaded to have an implementation executed of the binding. So when I execute the implementation of the binding, which is this function, what the function will return, I will take here as dependency. And by this object returned by the module, by my binding module, I will have these properties. Therefore, I will be able to call the adapt function with the model, as you can see here. Now let's go and try to implement one by one what I designed here. First of all, but why not? Let's do it one at a time. So the adapt function will receive a model. Actually, this function will create an object, because with this model I will have to return something that's able to call some bindings, to register some bindings. I would like, for instance, to bind a property of my object to this input, the other one to this, and the result of function. So this binding I have to do here. I can do it in different ways. For instance, I can call a bind method and I say bind the property A to the control with the ID A. And then I would like to be able to continue with this and say bind the second property B to the control with ID B, and so on. the same with the result. But why not? I like to be able to say just bind, and this will take all the properties of my object and will try to bind them accordingly to a control with the same name. It's an utility convention for me not to say have to register all the bindings, but in the same time I like to be able to specify my bindings if needed, not for all the properties and not to the control with the same name. So the bind method that's going to be returned by an object created by adapt would have to provide different ways of binding. Therefore, let's go to the adapt method and create here what we need to have. So first of all, we need to have in here, we need to have a new method called bind. And I attach to the object that I'll return, I'll attach this as a context. So on this I create a bind function. This function will receive two properties, two arguments. The property that I want to bind and the control to which I bind. In the end I will return this, and what I did is to attach a new function to this. Okay, but then let's check if I have two arguments. I can do it in different ways, either call the arguments keyword, which is referring to the arguments with which the method is executed, but then I can use the property itself and check if the property is undefined. If it is undefined, that means that I have no arguments. This is the first one and now it's undefined. Therefore, I'd like to iterate through all the property that my object has, and for that I iterate the model and take all the keys defined in the model, and then I do a bind to this property, and that's all. In the end I will have to I will just bind each property at a time. Otherwise, I check if I have defined a control. So if the control is undefined, it means that I have a property, but there is no name for the control. I can do, for instance, here I like to bind the object, the property A, but to a control with the same name. No problem, I can do that as well. Why not? In this case, what I do, I take the name of the control to be the name of the property, and I continue binding. This means that what I check then would be to see in here if it's undefined I have no problem, but here I have to do a return okay, after binding all the properties. What I do next is to check if the property is a function or not, because if it's a function, then I will need to re-evaluate the function each time, of course. So I'll do a bind from the model to the view, but there is no meaning of setting the value for the function. So I check if model of property, if I check the type of this, it's equal to function. Okay, if it's a function, I need to register somehow the bindings, because this would have to be evaluated each time. Then let's just create inside a variable which will store the bindings, such bindings, which will be an array. So if it's a function, then I take the bindings and I push a new binding on top of it, and I will set some properties that I will later need to use. First of all, I need to set a property to store the property which is the name of the function. Then I need to know what's the name of the control to which I bind. So if it's a function, then I save the property, the binding, and then I need to take the value of my control. So I take the value of the model. When I in order to access the function, I call the model of property, and then I call the function, injected as context the model. So because I'm injecting the model as the context in here, when I call the function result, in this case, this will be actually the model. So it will be able to access this dot A and this dot B. Then I took the value returned by the function, and I need somehow with my jQuery to access the input, or the span in this case, to access the DOM. So what I'll do next would be to provide a way to access a control with jQuery, with my own small jQuery implemented from scratch. So what I do here is I say, please find me the control by its ID, and then set its HTML, which will set actually the inner HTML to be this value. Therefore, let's make sure that I implement this feature. I go back to my jQuery, where for instance I set my function is checking if the selector is document. But then I also need to do some other checking. Like for instance, if it's not a document, probably it's an ID of a tag. So let's find that tag inside the document. The document has a method called query selector, which is able to select an element with different selector. And because I'm only using IDs, the selector for the ID would start with a hash. So I try to find my tag inside the document. If I return the tag, that's perfectly alright, but I'd like to provide some other utilities on top of the tag. So let's just create some other wrappers to work with tags. And let's suppose that I have two kind of wrappers. I have a wrapper for a generic tag, and let's say that I will have a function called wrap tag, which will receive as parameter the tag itself. Okay, but then I would like to have another function to be able to wrap an input, wrap input tag, which will receive the tag as well as an argument, but will provide different features. So what I do here, I check if my tag is an input or not. So the tag has a property called tag name, and I convert this to lowercase. And if this is equal to input, then I will return wrap input tag of tag. Otherwise, it's gonna be a generic tag, and I will just return wrap tag of the tag. Okay. So now, what I need to have for a generic tag would be the ability to set its inner HTML. So let's say that I have a function which is setting the HTML. In the end, I will return this. Okay, that's fine. Now, my function would work in two ways. If I provide an argument, we'll set the inner HTML, but otherwise we'll get the value for that property. So I check if the argument it's not undefined. If it's not undefined, then I'll set the inner HTML of the inner HTML to be the argument. Otherwise, I expect to return the inner HTML because it's like a getter. Okay, that's fine. Then I will also need to subscribe to some events of my tag. So let's say that I define a function to subscribe to an event, and it will receive an argument, the name of the event, and the callback that's going to be invoked when the event will happen. So what this function does actually, will take the tag and will add an event listener for the given event, and the callback will be this one. That's fine. So now I'm able to set the HTML inside my tag, or get it, and also subscribe to an event. That will actually support my binding here, setting the value of the control. Now let's move on to some other stuff. Okay, so in my binding, what I did already for a binding to a function was to remember the binding, get the value for the first time, and do a model to view bind. So now I display the value for now inside my object. As the function will not change unless I change the model, I expect to do nothing when the function cannot change itself. So this will not be changeable. I don't expect to bind to a control which enables editing the value for the function normally. So in this case, I will have a binding to a span. I cannot change, I cannot edit directly this value. So I expect to update this value only when the model was changed. Then, if the binding is not to a function but to a property, what I need to do then? I need also to set a value of the control. So then I access the control again, and I would like to have a function to set the value of the control as being the current value of the property. So because this will be an input, and I simplify my implementation only to support editing with inputs, I'll go to jQuery and I will provide a function to set the value inside the input. So I go here, and in here I wrap a tag. But if it's an input, I wrap a tag, an input tag. So in here I also create a function called value. This will be a function as well, and it will receive as argument the value I like to set. Okay, so this is actually an utility to be able to set the value of an input. Okay, but what I like to have here would be that this input will inherit from the generic tag, so it will be also able to at least subscribe to an event of it. In order to do that, first what I need to do is to call the wrap tag constructor. So I call this function with the tag. This will initialize on the this who is calling will initialize those two properties, those two methods. But then I define additional properties as so, as you can see here. Okay, so I will take all the properties, all the functions defined by the constructor of a wrap tag, and then I'll define some new ones. And in the same way, if my arguments is not undefined, then I will expect to set the value, and because it's an input, it will have a property called value, so I'll just set the value. But otherwise, if the value is not defined, if I call it without any arguments, I will just return the value of my tag. So I take the tag and get its value. Okay, so this is what this will do. Okay, in the end, I'm returning this as an object created with this function. So now I return this wrapper or this one. Okay, let's then continue, and now that I have implemented the support to set the value, go back to the bindings, and with my binding I'm at the point that for a binding to a value, I got the value from the model, and I set the value in the UI. So I do a model to view binding. Then I need to register a callback, to register an event when the value was changed by the UI to update the model as well. So I subscribe to the control, and because it's with the on function, and because it's an input, I support only inputs of type text, I bind to the key up event with a function which will be called when the user edited the value inside. This function will have to get the value from the control, and therefore we'll access the control by its name, okay, and then we'll take the value of the control, okay. This is the first step. The next one would be, and this is a bit tricky, as I don't have any information about the type of the value, except if I check what's inside the value right now, I'm not able to do any conversion, any parsing. And because I'm doing a sum, if I set the value as it is in the control, it will be a string. So when I do a sum, actually I'll concatenate the strings, which is not my intention. Therefore, what I'll do next, in order to set the value of my property in the model, would be to check the type of the value that was already set in the model of property. If this type it's a number, then I'll have to parse the value that I need to set in the same way to be a number as well, okay. So in this case, what I'll do, I'll call a parse float method, which will be able to handle also integers or double values. So I take the value and parse the value. In case it's not a number, then I just simply put the string inside my object. In case the value is a date, I will need to parse it as well, but let's stick with just numbers. This will ensure that each time the UI was changed, the model will be updated also. However, because I can also have bindings to functions, I need to update all the functions. I don't know if they need to be updated or not. I don't know the internal implementation of the function, but still I can assume that since the model was changed, some functions need to be updated, need to be called again. So I just iterate with a numeric index through all the bindings that I have. And what I do for each binding would be first to take the value. So now I invoke, as I did before, I invoke the model, I invoke the function, but now the property will not be that simple text, but I will take the bindings of I, and from that I will take the property to which I bind. Now that I have the value, because I don't expect to convert this to anything, but just to output it, I will then display the result, but for that I have to take the bindings of I and get the name of the control to which I need to bind, and then set its HTML to be this value. Okay, so this is what I do, and in the end, after doing the binding, after implementing this, I'm returning this, which will be the result of the adapt. But because I like to be able to call bind again, even in the bind method, I will return this. And I need to change here as well, because when I do a bind to, anyway, maybe not, because in this case, if I do a bind without any property or control, I bind all the properties and I don't expect to be able to call bind again. So I just call bind without any property, I will bind all the properties, and that's all. But if I call a bind with a name of a property, even with a control to bind to that, I'm expecting to be able to call it in a cascade, in a sequence, so I will just return this to be able to call bind again. Okay, so now that I did that, I have just to implement the require framework, because now I'm able to define a module, require some dependencies to be injected, even define my logic in here, like subscribing to document ready, defining a model with some functions, also adapting the model and bind to all the properties that the model has with the UI and include that. So all is implemented except the one which is actually the required, the work with modules, the support of working with modules. Okay, so this will allow me to define modules and execute them one time, define them one time. For that I will have a global arguments, let's call that globals, and this will have two properties. First, I will need to find a list of defined modules. I need to have a list of defined modules, which will be an array. But then when I compile a modules, I will like to have a list of compiled modules. You should see this in the following manner. When I define a module, I specify the name of it, dependencies, and the implementation. When I use a module, I expect the implementation to be executed once, the result to be stored in a cache, and then what this will return is what I will be able to use. And in my case, in here, I'm returning nothing. I don't expect to do anything with what I'm defining here. But in case of bindy or jQuery, as you can see, jQuery is returning a function, and I use a lot this function after that. The bind is returning an object, and I like to be able to call some methods on that object. As you can see in here, I'm trying to do something with the result of bindy. So what the require will do, first we'll collect all the definitions of the modules, and then when I include a module, just for instance to resolve some dependencies of another module, when calling the implementation, implementation, okay, I like to be able to do that with this framework. So what I do when defining a module, I will take the globals, the definition of the modules, and I will just put another definition for that index, which will then have some properties I will need later on, like the name of the modules should be the value of the name argument. The dependencies of the modules should be the value of the list of dependencies. And why not, I'm just doing a copy paste not to misspell that twice, I take the implementation as well. So defining a model is quite easy, just remembering what we need to do with it. When I include a module, first of all, let's check if I already compiled the module. So if globals contain in the compiled modules by the name of the module something, so if it's not undefined. If it's not undefined, then I get the globals, the compiled modules by the name, and I just return the compiled module. If not, I need to resolve the dependencies first, like including them, compiling them, executing implementation, and then provide as arguments for the implementation of the current module those dependencies. So let's just create an array called dependencies. Then let's iterate through all the dependencies that my function, my definition of the module has. So I take the defined modules by the name, and then I take its dependencies. Okay, and I take all the, this is going to be a length property, and I iterate through all the dependencies of my module. And then what I do, I put the dependency, I store as the resolved dependencies what I get by actually calling this dependency to be included. So now I take the defined modules by the name, and I then include the name of the dependency, and in this case I'll take the dependencies of I. Okay, so what this says is, in order to execute the implementation of my module, to compile the module, to execute it by the definition of it, I need first to resolve the dependencies. So I iterate through all the dependencies and take the dependency name, which will be in the definition of the module, and then I ask the framework to resolve recursively this dependency, because the dependency can have dependencies as well. As you can see, my index is depending on jQuery, which has no dependency, but also on bindy, which has a dependency to jQuery. So when I actually include my main module, this will include its dependencies, as you can see here, but for bindy, in case of bindy, I need to include this module, which will need to include the jQuery first. Now, what I have to do would be to actually compile the module. How do I do that? First of all, I need to store in the list of compile modules by the name of the module what I get by calling a method. So which will be the method, which is the method I go to the definition of my modules by its name, and I take the implementation. I apply the implementation, and be careful not to call but to apply, and I will pass the context as the caller and the list of resolved dependencies as arguments. As I said, be careful not to call and do an apply instead, because I like this array to be considered as the arguments of the function. If I do a call instead of apply, the result will be the following. This will be the context, will be injected, no problem with that. However, the arguments applied here will be treated as only one argument. So instead of having a list of arguments filled by that array, I'll have called this function with only one argument, which is not what I expect to have. So be careful and remember to do that. Each time you have an array of arguments and you need to call a method with those arguments inside the array, call apply instead, call the method with the name call when you have a list of objects and you are able just to fill the list as the method would expect to have. Okay, so now that I executed the implementation, I only need to return this compiled module, which is the interface exposed by the module. Now that we are ready, let's just do the demo. But we forgot to do something. As we defined the module bindy, we didn't include the module, so let's first include the module here. So I go to the script, to the source, and I set the source to be bindy. Come here to be bindy again, and then I just load my UI. As you can see, the value has been binded from the model, and when I change something in here, the function will be automatically called. Okay, so each time I change here. Of course, when I try to pass such value, I will get not a number exception, but then as soon as I enter some numeric value, I will then have its sum computed automatically. So what you should be able to see from this is that first I'm able to define some modules and to organize my code. Then I'm able to define my interface without any logics inside. It's just pure templating. Okay, it's not able to consume a collection with complex bindings, but nevertheless I can specify some IDs inside my tags, and I can in a descriptive manner add bindings, like for instance I'm defining a model on top of my my UI, and I can create some utilities just to bind that model to the UI. So each time I do some changes, as you can see in here in the model, then the changes will be reflected by the UI, and I have a pure and clean UI. I have a pure and clean controller, as you can see here. I define my model. I can take the model, for instance, from a REST endpoint, and then I can inject the model in the UI, and when the UI will change the values will be changed in the model as well. So now I can implement a feature in the depth binding, so that each time the model has been changed, I will know what elements has been changed, and I will be able to post them back or put or do a patch on the REST endpoint to save the changes. So that will be done automatically in a clear manner. That's all.